So this is Amaya Atucha and Allison Jonjak on May 26th, and we're wanting to reach out with you for a new format for the Cranberry Crop Management Journal. So this is just one article, and the rest are going to be in your normal format. But we wanted to talk about some of the, as people have flooded for spring frosts and dropped those floods down, we've seen a lot of leaf drop revealed. Amaya's fielded a lot of questions, and I've heard a lot of questions, and so we wanted to talk about those things a little bit. Amaya, as we are having this leaf drop revealed, can you talk to us a little bit about, well, as we discussed a little bit, do we want to talk about what we might know about what has caused or what hasn't caused it, and what we do know going into that?
Yeah, I think that it's such a complicated question in terms of what are the physiological causes for these leaves to drop earlier than we would expect. So one of the things that we know is that as the fall arrives, the plant overall starts preparing to be able to go dormant and to start, increasing their resistance to cold. And so one of the possible causes of this leaf dropping might be, early winter damage when maybe the leaves are not completely acclimated, and we see some damage. I mean, the leaves, they also need to go through a process of acclimation, just as we've talked so many times about bud cold hardiness. But the leaves are pretty tough, but even if they're tough, they still have to acclimate. And so maybe an early, very cold winter event could have triggered this damage, and we don't see it until, everything starts kind of like growing again. So this might be an old damage that we see on the leaves. Desiccation maybe as well could be something, really, really kind of like freeze dehydration could be another expression of the same. It's just still cold damage that results on this leaf drop that we see earlier that we wish it would happen.
And I've heard a couple of reports of a grower in the northern areas where there's a fair amount of damaged vines, and including leaf dropping, and one grower who had done some flooding of an early November snow event just to melt off the snow seems to be having fewer issues with that than some of his neighbors that weren't able to do that. So that's just one thing to add to our hypothesis arsenal.
I think that, it's so hard when we have this event and we start comparing what one grower did and the other grower didn't do, and it's really very hard to find the specific cause of this. Yeah. And it seems like every year, so many years, not so many years, I haven't been here so many years, but every year I've been here, it's always been, but I did this, and my neighbor did this other thing, and they saw more. I think that one cause that might predispose maybe some vines to have more of this damage would be any kind of stress during the growing season. I think that vines that have been probably overcropped or a stress for some reason could be more vulnerable to have this kind of damage.
Okay. Another question I like to ask and get your thoughts on, how, if I can have damaged buds up to a certain level and then the point at which they actually die, how much damage are we able to bounce back from? And I ask that both how much damage are we able to bounce back from to not see a yield hit, but then also how much damage are we able to bounce back from to not have subsequent problems with next year's yield?
That is a really good question, actually. That's something that we are working in the lab, and what some of the research we're doing, we're trying to connect what it is injury, that is actually what you see, and what is actually damage. And when we talk about damage, we talk either growth impairment, like the buds don't develop completely, or loss of yield. So how does injury relate to damage? And that's kind of like the key questions. When you just think about and you see some damage, some injury there, does it mean that it's really the body's damage or it's going to recover? We don't really know. One of the things that from all of these years that we've been trying to study the mystery of cold hardiness in cranberries, we've sort of identified that there's certain areas of the buds that tend to be more susceptible to damage. And when I'm talking about the buds, I'm talking about dormant buds, completely tied buds.
Mhm.
And so one of the areas is right that area that connects the base of the bud with the stem. So that section right there is an area that seems to be kind of key to whether there's going to be damage or not. If you see symptoms of injury there, if you see that area starts getting brown, that results in growth impairment. That we know very well. And you know, my PhD student Camilo Villota, he has been doing. I mean, he's done so much work on that area, and that's why one of the things that we recommend the growers is instead of dissecting the buds to look at the damage in an equatorial way, which you would dissect them and you would look at the bud and you will see what the flowers are going to be. We want to cut them sort of in a vertical, more longitudinal way so that we can see that area. And when that area has damage, we know that with very little damage, the buds are not going to fully develop. And that's something that we're actively working on.
That sounds like really valuable research, and I look forward to having more answers on it.
Yeah, it's also incredibly challenging, but I think we've made progress. I think in these 5 years that we've been working on that, we've really made progress to try to understand the different areas of damage. And another thing that is always something that comes during this time of the year, maybe a little bit earlier, is like how can we relate what is causing those changes in cold hardiness, that susceptibility to cold, especially when the buds are still tied. Like, should I flood? Should I not flood? What should I do? And so those kind of projects are still going on. It's really hard to kind of identify all of that and tear them apart, and maybe that is just only one factor affecting them. So try to put everything together and identify whether it's temperature, whether it's light, or whether it's minimum temperature or maximum temperature. What is it that is weighing more in the loss of cold hardiness during that time of the year? It's very challenging. Even though we've been doing many years of data, I don't think we still have a clear understanding of what it is. So we're going to keep working on that.
Okay. I've also heard some reports of some rusty colored spring damage. Do you want to talk about the physiology of how that can come about?
You mean the color that looks like sort of like copperish?
Yeah, copper, orangey, bronze, yeah.
I think that might be maybe later damage, or the expression of later damage compared to when the leaves just completely drop. I would think that maybe that color that developed is maybe something that happened after the ice was off.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might be like two ways of distinguishing whether the damage happened earlier in the fall versus early spring.
Okay.
Yeah. One thing that I want to say is like when I get this question, the first thing I get is like, what can I do about it? Like, what can I apply? What can I fertilize? What can I do?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that really there's nothing that is going to fix it that is sort of like a miracle worker. The only way for it to be fixed is that the plant needs to start producing carbohydrates again. Photosynthesis needs to happen again, so that the plant can use those carbohydrates to build new tissue. And so when the question is, can I apply nitrogen fertilizer? Will nitrogen fertilizer fix this? And the reason why nitrogen fertilizer is not going to fix it now is that the nitrogen that we put for the plants is for many different structural parts of the plant, but one of it is very important, is the production of chlorophyll, which is the molecule that is involved in photosynthesis to capture the energy of the sun and produce carbohydrates with it. And it's the carbohydrates that make the plant grow, and the roots grow, and the fruit grow. So if you're just putting nitrogen there, it's not going to make that plant produce anything if the plant is not active. It's just a waste. And so the only thing that you can do is wait until the plant starts waking up. You start seeing those buds elongated, and pretty early on, actually, around like roughneck, we can see that the new structure is already photosynthetically active and producing carbohydrates. And so as soon as that is happening, what the growers need to keep an eye on is like, how is that new growth developing? Is that new growth looking healthy and green? If not, well, maybe, yeah, it might be worth to put some fertilizer. But if it's looking nice and it's growing, developing, then there's nothing to do. The new growth will take over the producing carbohydrates and replace those old leaves, pretty fast.
Okay. Is there a possibility, if I'm worried about having weak spots, since I've had a bunch of leaf drop and a bunch of winter damage, and having a bunch of my canopy open for weeds to grow up, might I, once I get to roughneck and once I'm producing new carbohydrates, want to do a little extra fertilizer at that point to help with more vegetative growth, just to kind of close the canopy and outcompete some of the weeds?
That's a kind of a tough question. If you put fertilizer during that time of the year, what's going to happen is that you're going to end up with longer uprights.
Gotcha.
And the question is whether you want those uprights to be that long. And so that's why we always think about waiting for the fertilizer to the point where you actually have the fruit already set, because that fruit is, that's where all those new carbohydrates, all that new nitrogen is going into those leaves that are actively producing photosynthesis and feeding those fruits, and that's the perfect time. Now, what's going to happen is that if your canopy is open, it's a pain with the weeds, but also that extra light is going to produce new uprights, and those new uprights are going to have flowers for the following year. And so that might also be positive in terms of increasing your production, because you're just opening up for new spot on those runners to produce new uprights.
As long as you can keep the weeds out, I guess, but
As long as you can keep the weeds out,
So that's an important place for people who have weak spots after this winter damage, to be aware of, keeping the canopy open to make room for the new uprights.
What I would be concerned also with applying the nitrogen to try to fill up the canopy is that you're also going to be feeding the weeds.
Right. Yes. Okay. So that important herbicide decisions and other weed control methods in those weak spots. The last question I had before kind of going into where fertilizer might fit any of those questions is if people are seeing waterlogged roots, either from having flooded a fair amount or having just kind of consistent rain events. I'm expecting that we are tempted to want to add fertilizer to try to coddle the waterlogged roots, but I think probably the only real answer is going to be to let the soil profile dry out.
Yeah, again, the fertilizer is not going to fix this. There's no, as I said, the nutrients are just not this, magical substance that is going to make the plant grow. What happens, and I think that one of the things that is pretty clear from the root study is that, first of all, the roots, during those 2 years that we looked at root growth, we didn't see any new roots starting to grow. At about like bloom time, we started seeing the first new roots. And so the reason for that is one, the soil temperature. Really cold soil temperatures are not conducive to root growth. But the second one, I think, is it has to do with how the plant prioritizes where those carbohydrates are going to go. So at the very beginning, during bloom time, you have all this support of this new growth, and the fruit is the priority. So everything goes to the fruit. But once the fruit is set, and you have this whole new upright full of very, very efficient leaves that are producing a lot of carbohydrates, then that's when the plant decides, oh, okay, you know what? Now I have enough that I can put into the root system. So I think that, that's the way it works. And that's why we see that after harvest, in post-harvest, when we remove the fruit, all of those carbohydrates go into the roots, and that's when we see this big flush of roots. And so the plant regulates itself. So even if you put more nitrogen, more potassium, more phosphorus, it's just not going to change the way that the plant is prioritizing the things and where to allocate that carbohydrate. So unfortunately, there's no magical fertilizer that you can apply, or biostimulant, or any of those things that I hear people saying that they swear by, and all these beautiful microorganisms are going to do all these things. It just doesn't work that way. What it does help is anything that is possible to drain those beds. So cleaning ditches, improving drainage is the only thing that is going to keep those old roots healthy, waiting until the time comes where they can produce new roots.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful to remember. The last question I had, you've already done a really good job summarizing. When does fertilizer help, and what does it help for? It helps, as I'm kind of rephrasing you here, it helps to let the plant do a better job at the action that it was currently already going to take, and applying fertilizer out of season for, hoping to get hoping to do bud recovery when you are not growing buds isn't going to help. Hoping to put down fertilizer to grow roots when the plant is not ready to grow roots isn't going to grow any roots for you. So if you want to add any final kind of summary comment to that.
That's the thing. When the plant is not active, it's not going to be uptaking those, or it's going to be uptaking them in a very, very, very tiny portion. So it's just a waste. I don't think that they do any benefit. I mean, the time for those fertilizers is during the growing season, when you have those leaves that are actively producing carbohydrate, where you have the demand from the fruit. Obviously, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, they're part of a structural, kind of like the blocks that build up the plant. So the plant needs them as it's growing. But once the fruit needs to grow, it's carbohydrates what's going to make it grow, compared with the smaller percentage of nitrogen and phosphorus. And well, potassium is one important, but potassium is not something that forms a structural part of things like proteins or lipids or sugars. So it's mostly dissolved in it's part of the water, it's part of the cell inside, but it's not like phosphorus and nitrogen that forms proteins, for example. But again, all of that is happening during the growing season.
Yes.
The plant is not growing during the other time, so there's no point of putting it there. It's just really not going to do anything.
Yep. So as people are seeing their weak spots coming in after a hard winter on some of the high spots, I guess making sure to do a good job of weed control so that cranberries are what grows back in those weak spots. That's maybe if someone wants to focus their energy to something, that might be a good place to focus it on instead of fertilizer.
Yeah, and again, if those weak spots are not growing as you hope they were, they're looking weak, they're looking yellow, that's when you would want to apply a little bit of fertilizer earlier than the normal time. That would be after bloom, just to to help them keep growing. But you already need to see active growth happening.
Okay. Awesome. I appreciate all of that insight. Any closing remarks?
No, that's about it. I mean, just I don't think that now is the time to waste our resources when we don't need them. So just save that and wait for the growing season, and when the plants are active and we can already see fruit setting, to put your nutrients at that time. That's when really you're going to get the best results.
Perfect. Thank you for your time, and
my pleasure.
Yeah, we'll talk with you soon.
Thank you. Bye.